In the case of nuclear or radiological fallout, people living around potential targets such as military bases and chemical plants may be advised to evacuate.
Hello, I think the stream's live. I'm Nina, and Benjamin is here. Hopefully. Just waiting for Benjamin to come up on the screen. I don't know if everyone else can see him. Let's let's see. I think people in the chat are saying, Ben, you've taken a dark turn. Well, he's always blackpilling us in the kindest possible way when it comes to recognizing the sorry state of things, and I'm sure he'll be here. And well, hello everyone from Greece. I'm currently online on a very small island with 300 people. I kind of want to show you the sunset, actually. See if I can do this while we're waiting. This is the opposite of a black screen. Okay. Look. Isn't this brilliant? Okay, can people in the chat hear me? Okay. Let me I can take over for a bit. So we're taking over for Doug for this week, and Doug will be away for this hour, for this session for today. So yeah, as Benjamin says in the chat. People can hear me and see me, right? Okay. All right, great. Thank you. Secret. Is this a Nina Power AMA? Ask me anything. Sure, why not? Let's do that for 2 seconds. Fantastic. Right, maybe Ben's coming on. Okay. Well, I mean, I'll sort of wait for Benjamin, but the general theme today is going to be on the First Amendment and free speech, and the question of censorship and so on. Obviously, there are slight differences in this question between the UK and the US, but given that American culture is kind of our culture too, everyone in the Anglosphere is constantly aware of everything that's happening in America. And obviously this question of cancel culture is coming up in relation to Jimmy Kimmel, and whether the right are now using the tactics of the left, and I think we have to admit that the left have been using cancel culture tactics for perhaps a decade at least. We can talk about that. I think it's interesting to note that in the Charlie Kirk memorial, Erica Kirk suggested said from a Christian point of view that she forgives the killer. And I think there's sort of perhaps some confusion about the relationship between the Christian idea of forgiveness and what that might mean for justice in this world. We were looking at this article. Actually, I'm going to put this in the chat. So there's an interesting article published a year or two ago. By a friend of mine called Sebastian Milbank, which argues that there has never really been any free speech. And I think this is an interesting place to start from, in fact. So I'm just going to try and connect my YouTube account so I can post in the comments.
I think I'm here now.
Yes.
There we go.
Yep. Okay. Benjamin, would you like to frame the conversation in a much more stylish way? All I've done is run around and shown a sunset and blathered incoherently for a couple of minutes.
Yes. So, okay. First, I should just explain that Doug is not here today because of something tragic that's occurred in his family. So I am hosting, but I have, of course, not hosted one of these live streams before, hence the technical difficulties that you've all experienced, which are now thankfully over. So today we're going to talk about free speech. Nina has found a piece from a couple of years ago in The Critic by Sebastian Milbank that she thinks is an interesting, perhaps, way of coming into this, of framing the conversation. In terms of introductions, I, of course, am Benjamin Studebaker, author of The Chronic Crisis of American Democracy, The Way Is Shut, and Legitimacy in Liberal Democracies. And this is Nina Power, who usually does the lack with me, but today is here to talk about free speech. So, of course, the prompt for talking about free speech is the Jimmy Kimmel thing. The Jimmy Kimmel thing that everybody probably will have heard about. Jimmy Kimmel, his show on ABC, was suspended after Jimmy Kimmel made comments in which he suggested that the person who assassinated Charlie Kirk is a MAGA supporter. So, Nina, let's start with this piece and why this piece attracted you. Why, when I said let's talk about free speech, you thought immediately of this piece. And maybe I'll even put the piece in the chat. Maybe I can do that.
I've been trying to. I think sometimes YouTube blocks links. I've had this issue before, but I've told people how they can find it. Oh, there you go.
Maybe I can do it as the host. Yes.
Oh, okay.
The powers of being the host allow me to do it.
Okay, fantastic. Wonderful. Right. So people have access to the piece. Well, okay. So obviously I think we're familiar by now with the obvious takes on free speech, right? So whether it's from a First Amendment point of view, and recently we've seen this discussion about left-wing cancel culture and right-wing cancel culture in the wake of people being fired for celebrating the assassination, the murder of Charlie Kirk, and whether this is fair play, whether this is just giving the left a dose of their own medicine. It reduces language, I think, to a question of power. And one of the reasons I like the Sebastian Milbank piece is that he suggests that, first of all, that there's never really been truly free speech. I mean, of course, even with your wonderful First Amendment, there are restrictions. You're not allowed to violently threaten. You're not allowed to defame. Or, I mean, of course, you can do those things, but the point is they're not covered by the First Amendment, right? So, and obviously we have seen people engaging in this kind of rhetoric, right? That often. But it's rather to say, like, what is the free speech for? Like, what is the point of speaking freely? Right? Is it towards a kind of common good? Is there a sort of telos to free speech? within a particular political system, right? We obviously understand that authoritarian and repressive regimes, well, they like the free speech that the tyrant agrees with, but there are usually restrictions on what people can say, like criticizing the regime. For example, people will be executed or punished for this kind of thing, and there's been much debate about this just from a UK point of view, insofar as there have been a lot of instances of what people are calling two-tier justice, whereby various people have been imprisoned or questioned by the police for saying things that would definitely be covered by the First Amendment in the US. And I wonder if part of this is because we all live in America now, as Ramstein point out. And I wonder if people in the Anglosphere, including the UK, almost act as if they are American, right? They act as if we have the First Amendment, and we very clearly do not. So I don't know if you want to say a little bit about the American situation as in a technical sense, first of all.
Yeah, so I think that one of the things that often is centered in discussions of free speech that are left-coded, and appropriately so, is that if there is a power to censor, it typically is not going to belong to the workers. And certainly it's not going to belong to any workers who are engaged in any kind of revolutionary activity. Not only will they not possess the power to censor, but the power to censor will typically be used to repress them and prevent them from being able to organize. For that reason, I think there is an appropriate and understandable impulse to be very defensive of free speech. And that is an impulse that I typically share, and I share it in this instance. The piece, however, that you link to in The Critic, I think highlights certain theoretical possibilities that would be relevant in a different kind of society, perhaps, one that is not dominated by the nasty capitalist states, the nation states, but which was constructed in such a way that you were actually trying to have a meaningfully generative or positive conversation that could lead to something actually helpful or useful. And often, to avoid this kind of argument, there's a claim, there's a kind of relativistic claim that all speech ought to be equally free because all speech equally has a claim to potentially being true, which leads to speech being deployed as a power instrument. And I think that part of the reason that people end up making that kind of argument is that they're concerned that if they admit that in principle there might be a case in which you would want to structure a deliberative environment or a speech environment in such a way that you were producing a high quality kind of conversation that could actually lead to truth or knowledge or wisdom or something decent or good, that will be used by capitalist states to excuse repressing workers and repressing workers' movements. But
Sure.
That doesn't mean that the argument in principle doesn't have some bite. It just would struggle to operate in something like our present context in a way that would be helpful to us.
I think one of the things that's been going on generally is this conflation or confusion between words and violence, right? It's this idea that it sort of is inflated since, I would say, the hate speech legislation, which comes in various ways in various states after World War II. And often this is done as a preventative measure to protect minority groups, for example, Jewish groups in Western countries so for example, there are about 0.4 to 5% Jewish people in the UK. And so they're clearly a minority by any measure. And so obviously various Western countries have laws around denying the Holocaust, for example, right? And there are various kind of, I think what we've seen is this kind of expansion of hate speech legislation in many ways, and also a concomitant confusion about what counts as hate speech. So this idea that words are violence or words can be violence is a kind of extension of the idea that words can hurt, right? Which clearly they can, I mean, it's upsetting to be attacked or accused of something that you're not, or something like this. But then I think at the dangerous end of that is the idea that if people say things or ask questions or make assertions that you don't like, this gives you the right to commit violence against them or threaten them, because they've already committed a kind of violence. And then we get this total blurring of the boundary between abstraction, concepts, terms, words, and physical action.
Yeah, there seems to me to be a double bind here, which is that if you have a capitalist state and you create a power to censor, or you create a capacity to have laws regarding something like sedition, that's going to be used to constrain what people can do to organize for something else that goes beyond that something better. At the same time, if you have a marketplace of ideas that is not altogether very likely to generate anything that goes anywhere or is particularly generative for socialists either. That seems to be the experience of living in mass culture in the total society. There doesn't seem to be a lot of benefit to the marketplace of ideas. And yet also, if you were to respond to that by bringing in some kind of power to have sedition legislation, that would just be used to crush the left. So the left is in a situation where it doesn't prevail in the marketplace of ideas, but also any attempt to qualify, regulate, or structure the marketplace of ideas to create opportunities for the left will just be used to further crush the left. So the left switches back and forth between, on the one hand, trying and failing to win in the marketplace of ideas, and on the other hand, trying and failing to use the state to structure the discussion in such a way that it can prevail. And in both cases, the left ends up losing. Either it loses in the marketplace of ideas to various kinds of barbarized discourse that are more optimized for the culture industry, or it loses by bringing in seditious powers that are then inevitably used against it.
Yeah, I mean, I think the fundamental philosophical question might be partly to do with the idea of what discussion is for, what language is for. Is it for dialogue and the pursuit of truth? And this would also maybe include various modalities of speech that might be, I mean, paresia is a very old idea, this idea of sort of speaking freely, but in particular contexts. I think we've also seen a diminution of the recognition that language can be used playfully or jokingly or ambivalently to try out ideas, or to, you know, to play a role, or for fiction even. And people have discussed this in the context of the diminution in reading in general, right? And then the ability to understand context and metaphor and simile and fiction all disappear as well, and humor. So you often get these sort of, I would say, very unfair readings of what people are saying. Like there's a sort of meanness in the interpretation of other people's speech if you've already decided that they are not on your side, as it were. And this is part of the kind of polarization. So it's like free speech for me, but not for thee, or playfulness for me. I can play with signs, but you can't. And if you do, I'm going to interpret everything you say in the meanest possible way, and in the most literal possible way.
Yeah, charity of interpretation is, of course, an intellectual virtue, and one that tends to be neglected in a case where people are trying to use censorship. And that censorship, of course, can take the formal form in the case of a state directly going after somebody for something they say, but it can also operate through ad hoc social pressure, so campaigns among people to get somebody fired. And then there's the horribly blurred case in which the state pressures people to use ad hoc social pressure to get somebody fired. So on a technical level, the state is not responsible for the ad hoc social pressure, which the state also encouraged. And this, I think, was a particularly nasty thing during the those congressional interviews with the various social media company oligarchs, where they would suggest that perhaps these social media company oligarchs are running monopolies to pressure them to regulate the algorithms in such a way that anti-establishment political speech is harder to disseminate.
Yeah. I mean, what do you think has happened in the Jimmy Kimmel situation? Just lay it out for someone who's not familiar with the American context.
Yeah. So in the Jimmy Kimmel situation, the same general tactics that have been deployed for a long time in the United States, where you have state actors and corporate actors working together to limit political speech that they don't like in a way that launders this process so that it can't be straightforwardly and easily framed as a First Amendment violation. That is something that has been going on really since 2016 quite aggressively. But of course, it's something that occurs and has reoccurred throughout American history. The thing that's distinctive about this is the blatancy with which it was done, the visibility of it. It's really easy to see that this is a case, and you're seeing it in real time. You're not hearing about it months or years later. You know, Mark Zuckerberg said that the state put pressure on him to reduce the reach of people who were posting content about the Hunter Biden laptop, right? Zuckerberg said that that happened. He said that that happened long after it took place. So it was difficult as it was happening to be sure that it was happening or prove that it was happening. And there was a lot of disagreement about what in fact was going on. Here in this case, it's being said immediately as it's happening that this is what has taken place, that the state has put pressure on ABC to get rid of Kimmel. And then, of course, because ABC has done it, it's ABC's decision. But this decision occurs against a backdrop of kind of mafioso energy about what might happen or what might befall you if you don't go along with the pressure that's being put on you. And the classic iteration of this is Lindsey Graham, a Republican who you would not think of as a trust buster, saying to, I think it was Zuckerberg, you don't think you have a monopoly? You know, a question that why would Lindsey Graham ask that? That's not typically something that is a concern of his. And why would he ask that to somebody like Zuckerberg as opposed to somebody like Bezos, who has a much larger company that plausibly occupies a much larger percentage of the market share of the sector that it's in? Why would he do that? Only for political reasons, and yet there was no possibility of holding Lindsey Graham to account for having said that. There was no mechanism legally in the United States to challenge that as an attack on the free speech of people posting on Facebook. And when the Mark Zuckerberg letter hit the internet long after all of this happened, there was no real political response to that. Nobody was able to do anything with that or use it to accomplish anything. Here, it's all very proximate and very visible and very immediate. And so there's an opportunity to discuss it more directly. But precisely for those reasons, it will be claimed that only Donald Trump does this and that it doesn't occur when Democrats are president. And this will be used to create a false distinction.
Yeah, for sure. I think we have to be kind of absolutely fair-minded in this sense, right? Say, look, this is not a one-side issue. And I mean, I think just as somebody who has experienced this kind of pressure on institutions, what's kind of revealing about it is not that the institutions believe what people are saying about you, it's that they're scared. Do you see what I mean? It's not about truth in any meaningful sense. It's this person is coming under attack. This is frightening and cumbersome. We don't want to deal with it. It's easier to get rid of this person. Right. And I think we've seen this over and over and over again. And yeah, certainly also recently in the case of people who seem to have been fired for celebrating the murder of Charlie Kirk, where people have gone after their employers and said, look, this person is saying these things and they should be fired. And it seems like in many cases, or in some cases, that has happened. I can see people making distinctions between, let's say, saying something like human beings can't change sex, and the police were called on women in Britain and others, for men and women, for saying this, which arguably is a true factual statement. It's certainly something that we might want to say people should be allowed to say, right? It is rather different from actively celebrating the murder of somebody, right? So on what basis can we differentiate between these types of speech, right? One, if we're going to say that there's something immoral about celebrating the assassination of somebody you don't like. And of course, we saw this in the attempted assassination of Trump twice before as well. And somebody stating something that might be unpopular, but should be allowed to be said and has a truth value. I mean, I guess it's certainly true that some people must be actively happy that Kirk is killed. I mean, they could say, well, it's true that this is how I feel.
I think one of the things that makes it difficult is that when you have a sufficient level of consensus or unity in a society or in a public, then you can speak perhaps meaningfully of public morals or of some kind of shared deliberative or epistemic purpose which public debate has. But in capitalism, you get a fracturing at minimum between capital and the working class. And perhaps beyond that, as further fracturing potentially takes place within the category of the working class or within the category of capital. And this fracturing makes it very difficult for the participants in a discussion or a deliberation to have a shared object or end. So when we try to evaluate discussion in capitalism in terms of, is this epistemically generative, we tend to struggle to produce enough agreement on the end at which epistemologies should be aiming to be able to adjudicate that question in a meaningful way. And so then it tends to devolve in this sort of Foucauldian direction and become a power struggle among different factions that have their own particular aims, which they conflate whenever convenient with a public interest or public morality or what society wants.
I mean, I think it's interesting if you look at what Marx says about free speech and the freedom of the press. And one of the first things he writes about is precisely the freedom of the press as a young man. And there's a case to be made from Marx's defense of free speech. Certainly, Marx says, look, these bourgeois rights, yes, of course, most speech is ideological, most speeches, that there's a certain kind of right to discourse, which is purely to shore up bourgeois conception of capital, and is usually being used as a kind of cover story, so that we don't recognize the real material constraints and the reality of exploitation and so on and so forth. But I think there is also a case to be made, and I've discussed this before, that there is a Marxist defense. There is a defense in Marx of freedom of association, freedom of speech, and so-called bourgeois rights. Of course, there's a sense in which these are limited under capital. They haven't achieved their final form, if you like, which would be in a kind of polyvalent society that sort of perhaps a kind of pluralism of opinion that would be directed to something like a socialist common good, right? Maybe. And indeed, we often perhaps get caught up in thinking of speech as opposed to material reality. Like the free speech discussion itself is also potentially a distraction, right? In the way that you're suggesting, I think.
Well, I think a lot of the deliberative Democrats have tried to move it in some way in that direction. So to talk about how would you construct a discussion or a deliberation that would be generative in the view of certain shared public goods. Of course, this requires presupposing, as Habermas does, that there is a sufficient level of unity, even in liberal capitalism, to be able to talk about something like that. And I think that's quite a difficult case to make. Indeed, I think that there's a tendency in liberal capitalism to project levels of unity onto people in the past that may not be really wholly earned or deserved. There's always some level of disagreement. And the question of what counts as sincere disagreement that's potentially generative and what counts as a seditious attack on the order that allows the discussion to take place, this is always a fraught issue. Even in, say, medieval societies in which we might think of Catholicism as providing a unitary framework, there's a great deal of debate about what counts as orthodoxy, what's heterodoxy, and what's heresy, there's levels and levels of potential being allowed versus not being allowed in a discussion like that. And that's precisely because even in that kind of society, there isn't clear agreement about what counts as legitimately pursuing the truth and what counts as trying to spread something that's potentially going to corrode or destroy order. And I think that there's a tendency to downplay how difficult and fraught that argument remains. You know, for instance, a lot of liberal writers in the 19th century made all kinds of claims about sedition as a qualifying element for them with respect to free speech. And I think that the reason for them that they could take sedition as seriously as they did is that they believed that their society was a liberal society that was oriented around common liberal objects. They denied or would be resistant in large part to Marxist critiques that would say that that level of unity did not obtain. Many Marxists will nonetheless claim that the unity was there in the past in some sort of pre-capitalist halcyon time, in which, of course, capitalism improves that period in various ways, but it also disrupts or breaks down the unity, according to many stories, that is said to have existed during these periods. But I don't think that that unity has ever existed with the level of totality that is supposed. And then people are always trying to pretend that they've got it, that they've got this unity, and therefore they can censor on the basis that they have it.
Yeah.
There's always a tendency to do that, to claim that the society is more unified already, because this is convenient also. If you think that you're speaking with the unified voice of the thing, it's very convenient. But rarely is anyone really in position to do that. And the throwing around of the people and society and the nation, you know, these constructed unities, always papers over the level of disunity that's still there. And therefore, any kind of concept of sedition that you introduce is going to be fraught and is going to be cited.
I think technically sedition was abolished as a crime in the UK not that long ago, actually. But it doesn't exist as it were. Like, people can obviously call for the overthrow of the state. We have various revolutionary parties that do this constantly, right? Whether you're calling for the abolition of the monarchy or a revolutionary overthrow of the government. And I think in many ways, this is a kind of recognition of the lack of power.
Yes, it's because it's not real sedition. You can say things that in the 19th century would have been seditious in the sense that they would have posed a threat to order. Those same words now spoken don't have the same effect, and so aren't seditious language in that sense.
But then there are new things that are deemed to be seditious, and I would mention the fact that for a lot of people on the progressive left, no debate was a core phrase. You know, there were certain things that you weren't allowed to speak about, and if you did, there would be punishment, social, economic, and so on. And I think that's very different from perhaps the world that Doug and I grew up in as Gen Xers, where in the 90s there was certainly, I think, an attempt to be very free with speech and transgressive, whether in comedy and culture and so on. I mean, of course, there were things that people weren't saying. And I think someone made this point in the comments a while back that really self-censorship is perhaps more important here, right? That it's not so much about what people say or don't say in the public sphere, and also what the public sphere is radically altered with the social media and the blurring of the boundary between private and public, which I think has also contributed to the idea that random strangers can get you fired for your job. You think you're posting something for your friends, but actually, no, it's a matter of public interest. But I think, this how to put it, this question of self-censorship, it's certainly in the UK, I would say, an increasing feeling that there are certain things that are really off limits. That's been kind of broken apart lately. But I think for a while there, it was like you knew that if you commented on social media or work about certain issues, that you were likely to be reported. And I think this idea of complaining as well to management or whatever, this was something that you never did. Like, you know, snitches get stitches, man. Like you don't complain upwards about somebody. Everybody turned into a little feedback monster. Not everybody, but you know, this became something that was, yeah, I don't know. We associate maybe more with the Stasi situation where people are kind of listening and recording and reporting on you. So yeah, I think the self-censorship thing has to be part of this discussion, really.
Yeah, I think that one of the effects of the demise of socialism as a meaningful force in the world is that it's easier for people to suggest that the kind of society that we presently have in some way, shape, or form already aims at truth.
Mm-hmm.
And that therefore defenses of it are simply defenses of the possibility of truth. So when we have contestation that in previous periods would have seemed like the kind of ideological contestation that you get in fractured and divided polities and societies, now when you get that kind of contestation, people claim that it's an attack on facts or on truth or on epistemology as such.
But is it not in some cases? I mean, there is such a thing as truth. There are such things as facts, despite McIntyre's claim that facts only emerge at a particular point. I mean, it does really very much concern me that people are stating or wanting to talk about things that have a truthy aspect and are being punished for doing so. I mean, I don't think the words are simply reducible to power in this sense, right? They have a referent, they have a meaning.
So I think sometimes when I talk about this, people think that I'm taking a postmodern position or defending
I know you're not, but
view.
Yeah.
But to clarify that, I think that part of what has happened is that we've moved into a historical period that gives rise to postmodernism. Mm-hmm. So creates a sort of appearance that there really is no fact of the matter because it generates multiple different plausible positions at once. There's a level of fracturing and division that goes on for a long enough period of time that is not resolved, such that many different positions really do genuinely seem to appear viable at the same time. And this seeming viability of a multitude of positions means that it will appear that each is genuinely pursuing the truth, but also each will view the other as having nothing at all to do with the truth. And so we get into a situation where it does become genuinely difficult to speak about truth in a way that unites.
Right, but shouldn't we try? I mean, surely, I mean, maybe I'm naive and committed to sort of democratic liberal ideals in some way, but surely there is a collective question of the pursuit of truth in the name of the good and even the beautiful. That is, that we as democratic subjects are potentially all part of, right? And it does matter.
Yeah, but part of what capitalism has done is alienate us heavily from that. So we are operating often in a position where people are focused on other things apart from the good as a consequence of the way that the society has become structured. And so to try to unite people in the view of something that might plausibly create a greater level of unity in the future or might have plausibly created a greater level of unity in the past will be somewhat out of tune with the time.
But I'm not as pessimistic as you in this sense. I don't think capital is totalizing in this way, right? Like I sure, people are alienated and exploited and in all kinds of ways and divided. But I don't think that means that we therefore, it seems too pessimistic to say, well, this is the reality and therefore perhaps any discussion of that points towards the good and the true is somehow already captured or constrained by
Well, I wouldn't
capital.
take it there. I wouldn't say that any discussion is already captured and constrained by capital. I would say that any discussion is limited by this set of facts. So what it's going to be able to do, the degree to which it's going to be able to have political unifying effects, is strictly limited as long as we remain in something like this context. And therefore, if we attempt to censor on the basis of it, we are going to be creating tools that we probably are not ourselves going to be able to use. Even if we do have the notion of what's good and what's true and what's right that's appropriate, we aren't going to be able to unify large numbers of people around that. So if we then try to deploy censorship tools and techniques on behalf of this, we're not going to be successful, and instead these things are going to be taken up by other people and used against us, because it's too polyvalent for us to in practice succeed with it at the political level.
But I think we have to try, and one of the points would be that there are things that are outside of politics. I mean, one of the devastating things that's happened is that everything has somehow become political, right? And then I think that was something that the so-called postmodern philosophers did predict, actually. But basically, politics is now covers things that were previously pre-political, right? The idea that one holds certain positions and beliefs, even something like being a Christian, is now usually right-wing coded, right?
Right,
But
that's a consequence of this structure. So to dissolve that, you would have to dissolve the structure that gives rise to it. And the trouble is that our attempts to dissolve the structure that gives rise to it tend to involve developing and deploying various tools and tactics, which are then used not just to prevent this outcome from happening, but to further frustrate it, such that it becomes even less possible.
Sure, but I think surely we have to try to live pre-politically or outside of politics in a certain way. I mean, the choices we make and the things we still have some limited choices vis-a-vis like freedom of association, the things we choose to do, spend our time doing, the people we associate with and discuss things with, and so on and so forth. I mean, maybe this is irrelevant. I mean, maybe this is simply not important politically.
But as you were saying, it's leaking into all of these areas gradually over time as this situation doesn't change, and if it does change, it intensifies. This kind of disputation leaks into more and more areas of life. So the areas that seem to be refuges from it become infected by it. Even the family, people whose families are being torn apart by political disputes over things that they have no power to change, nothing they can actually do in relation to these things. They're not organized in any way to have any effect on these things, and yet people are becoming estranged from their close relatives.
I mean, this is like devastating. Like the idea that people, I mean, this happened over every issue in Britain as well, like from Brexit to lockdowns to vaccines to Trump, even though he's not our bloody president. People broke friendships and even family relations over every single one of these issues, and marriages and so on and so forth. As if these issues are more important than, let's say, loyalty, duty, commitment, blood ties. I mean, come on, this is mental. Like, why has everything become so political? It's like, it's stupid.
But of course, what do people do? So you go online, and what do you see the people saying? They'll say, oh, if only we could unite behind the truth, as if it's just there waiting for you to choose it above the other things that you've been preoccupied with. It doesn't take seriously the reality of why this has occurred.
Well, can we not both understand the reality of why this has occurred and sort of bemoan it, and then also be committed to the pursuit of the truth collectively? I surely, is this too optimistic?
Well, the deliberative Democrats have tried to do this, right? If you go and read Habermas and his followers, they have tried in various ways to have something like that kind of position. But ultimately, it stays too much at the level of deliberation and discussion. in part
But if we
because
were
it's trying to insist
discussing-
on this possibility beyond a point at which the possibility has been foreclosed.
Right, but if we stayed at the level of discussion, we wouldn't be killing each other, right? This is an important thing. Like, who's that great quote from Krauss? Like, if we spent more time arguing over the semicolon, we wouldn't go to war. You know, and isn't there a sense in which, like Charlie Kirk, for example, in his dialogues and his discussions and his attempt to speak to people and to challenge them was actually kind of engaging in a Habermasian commitment to deliberative democracy and reason, like the commitment to reason, the idea that people can change their minds on the basis of better arguments, and in that
Well,
sense,
I will
right?
say that he did have a tendency to cut up his interviews with people to try to make his interlocutors look bad. It was not as if he was committed to filming uncut, extended interviews where people could really hear both what he said and what the interlocutor said and make a judgment. He was trying to shape the discussion toward a prefigured end, and he would do that by cutting the discussion up in such a way that it would favor his point of view.
Okay, but no one was compelled to speak to him, right? Like everybody volunteered and so on and so forth. And in any case,
Often
I mean,
under
like,
false pretenses, imagining on some level that if they talked to him, they really could have a discussion with him that other people might see that could go their way. But the truth was, if you talked to Charlie Kirk and you made a video with him, it would only be shown to anybody if it was deemed by him to be beneficial to his view that he entered the discussion with. There was no possibility of the discussion causing Charlie Kirk to change his mind, and there was no possibility of the discussion being self-consciously designed to produce an outcome different from the ones prefigured. So there's no possibility of aporia in a Charlie Kirk discussion. There's no possibility of any kind of Socratic dialectical process. It's, I have this position, other people have this position. Other people's position will be revealed to be stupid if I debate them using certain kinds of debate kid lines and tactics. I'll make videos in which I do this, and I'll cut out or exclude any part of it that doesn't fit into what I'm trying to do. And now everybody's pretending like, you know, he's Alan Bloom or something. You know, it's a whole different discussion from the discussion in the 80s and 90s that people are, and that discussion was a whole different discussion from the discussions that had gone on before, prior to that. Yeah, and why can't this be said? This is not, we're not talking about one of the great orators of human history here. We're talking about a guy who made propaganda videos for billionaires who gave him a lot of money.
right, but he didn't
This is
deserve
not
to be
Cicero here. No, of course he doesn't. And of course it's totally unacceptable and inappropriate. But can't we also say that he's not Cicero? You know, this is not, we're not talking about Henry Clay here.
Sure. I mean, there are sophists in every age, and I mean, the ancient Greeks recognized this as a permanent possibility of language itself, right?
Right. We don't have to pretend that he's Jesus Christ just because he was wrongfully assassinated.
Well, so was Jesus Christ, but
Right. So you don't, just because somebody is killed doesn't mean that you have to treat them like they're Jesus Christ.
Sure. I mean, obviously, the murder of Charlie Kirk is polarizing yet more, right? Like, it's the kind of the vast gap in the middle between people who thought this was a terrible thing and people who thought this was that he deserved it. I mean, this is like unbridgeable at this point, it seems.
Can't it be a terrible thing, but also, you know, it's not like he was one of the most amazing people who ever lived? Can't we have a kind of moderate, you shouldn't kill people, but also you don't have to pretend that anybody who gets killed was perfect or flawless or a saint?
Well, I think that would also go for the left hagiography. I mean, the celebration of Luigi Mangione, the celebration of George Floyd, and various others,
all of
right?
These
like
figures, all of these
everybody
figures.
establishes this pantheon in the absence of organized religion, or in a way, like everybody comes up with their new saints constantly. Greta Thunberg is a child saint. Luigi Mangione is a saint of the working class. I mean, come on, this is like, you know, by the way, I'm not suggesting that Greta Thunberg has killed anyone. She's not on the same the same level. But you know what I mean? Like, this tendency is I don't know, will never disappear, I think.
Well, I think it could in principle disappear, although it's maybe not likely to while we're alive. But it would require that there be an actual change in the social conditions that give rise to this kind of behavior, right? As you were saying, the tendency to make saints out of diverse figures who are regarded as demons by others is a product of living in a time where there are real reasons for division. And the thing that I find myself having to say to everybody lately, you know, no matter what their political ideology is that there are actual reasons for these divisions. They don't just come from nowhere. And the people who believe different things are not crazy or irrational or incapable of thinking. There are real reasons that the society and the structure becomes fractured to the degree that it has become. And to deal with that fracturing, you would have to do something that goes beyond making a discursive intervention. So people try every kind of speech act intervention under the sun. They try calling for unity. They try condemning the people that they don't agree with. They trying to cancel people with various kinds of language. There is no way of making a discussion that solves problems that have deep material roots. You can't just talk your way out of it.
Sure. But I mean, let's turn to the left for a minute. I mean, there's constant fracturing on the left, right? We know that, for example, the insult like class first, or, you know, this idea of being a class essentialist, and let's say being less interested in identity became something of a stick to beat people with, particularly people who were interested in the critique of political economy and who were by any measure better Marxists, right? More analytical. And a lot of these people got challenged because they weren't focusing on race or gender or whatever, right? We saw this happen a lot post-Occupy, and a lot of people have talked about the way in which these modalities of identity are actually much easier to push, and that there was lots of propaganda involved in pushing these, because actually perhaps the real danger is people organizing around unions and organizing around questions of class exploitation as opposed to oppression on the basis of identity. And I mean, the fracture, we see this in the UK. So there's this new party called Your Party, which involves Jeremy Corbyn and Zara Sultana and various other Muslims, has fractured already before anywhere near coming an election, on the basis that and it was supposed to unify, let's say, the pro-Palestine vote, the Islamic vote, which is now quite large in the UK, too large in my opinion. I don't think Britain is a Muslim country. I don't want it to be more of one. And then progressive ideas, right? So progressive ideas around gender, most of which are adamantly and strictly opposed if you are Muslim, right? By the way. So it's not clear how any of these alliances were ever going to work. It seems to have collapsed on the basis of some financial situation. And Sultana claimed that this was a boys' club and it was sexist, and it's all a bit of a mess. So there is this kind of, I think, tendency on the left for fracturing and fragmenting on the basis of particular concepts. And this seems to happen over and over and over again, right? So the unity, like even people calling for unity are struggling, are going to struggle, because this fracturing just seems to be constitutive of what it means to be on the left.
But not just of the left. I think that this is a fracturing that we see in every part of society, including in Islam, which is why it's very difficult to speak of Islam as having a unified view or a particular position about anything. The same is true for Christianity, in part because of a process of fracturing in Christianity, and in part because even when Christianity was supposed to be more unified, if we look deeply into the history of Christianity, we find that the level of unity within Christianity is continuously overstated insofar as it's applied to the early church, to late antiquity, to the Catholic Church. And the same is clearly true of Islam. Islam has many, many different currents in it, not just the Sunni Shiite divide, but an enormous number of splits in it. And also, there are likely to be further splits within Islam, in part because the political unity of Islam has been very recently in historical time further fractured and fragmented. So it wasn't so long ago that there were, two quite large Islamic states, the Persian state and the Ottoman Empire, that had some level of centralized influence over the structure of Islam within those territories. Now there's an enormous number of states, an enormous amount of fracturing. The traditional synthesis of the caliph with the state has broken down, and that will lead to more variations of Islam, and Muslims living in more countries and living as a minority demographic in more countries will change Islam and transform it and create lots and lots of different things, as it's done with Christianity, as it's done, these processes. There's no tradition of human thinking or of religion or of philosophy that's immune to the transformative pressures of different kinds of relationships with the state, of different levels of political order or disorder, and of course, economic change, social structural change. This is producing in every tradition of human thinking enormous divisions and fracturing, which people then try to escape with the call for unity or the call for pursuit of truth. But that call doesn't produce the effect.
I wonder if that doesn't overstate the power of modernity. I mean, obviously Marx has a point where he talks about the dissolution of tradition and the way in which everything solid melts into air. And we're very familiar with these claims that he makes about capitalist modernity and the way capital will inevitably globalize. But even if we suggest that, let's say, traditionalist Islamic views are merely a response or a reaction to modernity, they are still
not even that, because that would suggest that there was a unified character to the reaction. The Islamic State was opposed by many, many different Islamic denominations and factions, and many different states in the Middle East opposed it. So it's not as if becoming an Islamic State supporter is the trajectory of Islam in response to modernity. There's no unified trajectory of Islam in response to modernity. There's an enormous plurality of different ways of being still Muslim in some sense, while being modern, that all come into being at the same time. And each will claim that it is the one correct, inevitable telos of the thing, but they're not going to be able to make that reality on the basis of those claims.
I don't know about that. I think there are particular dominant forces within Islam that are more powerful than others. And actually, if we want to talk about the politicization of everything, Islam is right up there as having as a central feature the fusion of the worldly and the political, actually.
That was true in the Roman Empire, where the Roman emperor was the head of the Christian church. But then through a historical process of change, the unity between the church and the Roman Empire broke down and transformed, and Christianity became many different things as a consequence of that process.
Yeah, but I think the sort of separation of the kind of theological and the secular is something that is specific to Christianity. It's, we might say liberalism is Christianity's gift to the West in this sense, that the division between the worldly and the non-worldly is a kind of central feature. I mean, already you have, Elizabeth I saying, I don't want to make a window into men's souls. I don't care what you really believe. I demand outward conformity. It's not, and then after that, it becomes really not a question of coercion so much, right? That there is no, that you don't have to be, the one shouldn't force people to be Christian. right?
Yes, but I don't think that stems from the Christian doctrine as such. I think that stems from the reality of political division in Western Europe for hundreds and hundreds of years, from the fall of the Western Roman Empire. You're taught by Elizabeth I, you have 1,000 years of political division in Western Europe that makes it very difficult to coordinate Christianity or make it mean one particular thing. And even in the Roman Empire, before it fell, there were all sorts of different Christian denominations and factions running around all over the place. And it was quite difficult for the Romans to try to curate that or to make it into one thing. And they found in practice that they had to have a significant level of tolerance.
Yeah,
that's true. But what the breakdown of the Western Empire does is it creates different distinct power bases that can push particular instantiations of Christianity potentially. And states that decide to back the Protestant churches, as opposed to a single entity that has to have a unified response.
Yeah.
Or a gently pluralistic response within its political limits.
Yeah, I'm just checking the comments to see if there's something we should cover. I don't want a theocracy, says Barclay. I agree. I don't want one either. I would like people to live in a gentle and pluralistic manner.
People say they don't want one, and then they start talking about a truth that we all can just acknowledge. And
well, okay,
even if that's secularized and treated as not a religious thing, there is something about that will ring theocratic to people and result in that kind of interpretation.
Yeah, Tom Edwards says the gospel is completely unique within Abrahamic religions. I agree with Tom, actually. I think this sort of separation, the various separations that are within Christianity do just differentiate and distinguish it from Islam, for example.
I'm not denying that there are distinctions. Of course, if anyone were to simply claim that Christianity and Islam were identical, there would be all sorts of evidence that you could provide against that. That would not be my claim. Rather, my claim would be that certain historical forces and political forces have a transformative effect, regardless of the doctrine that you have, and that this transformative effect, while it won't make all the religions precisely the same, will change them in analogous ways.
We'll see.
We will indeed. Okay, so we're going to go and do the parrot room. We are going to do a parrot room. And so that's going to be the next stream, which we're going to hop over and do. This has been a somewhat rickety attempt to do this stream without Doug. Doug is great and valuable, and we appreciate him. And doing it without him underlines his value and importance. So hopefully Doug comes back before too long, because I miss him.
Me too. All my best to Doug.
All right. See you on the in the parrot room.